when I do an estate plan for people, it's because they need it. I don't have to convince them. You can have 2 parents and 3 kids with exactly the same number of assets held exactly the same number of ways, but it is entirely different from family to family. And the only way you're going to figure that out is by listening to them. So in addition to being authentic, is you have to listen, because they will tell you things in ways that are not responsive to the questions that you ask. Because one of the things that go in the documents are who your people are, whether for healthcare, finances, that kind of thing. Think of who your people are and who those people would be that you would trust in the event that you can't make decisions for yourself. And then what your goal is. Is your goal to make sure that you can leave as much money as possible to your alma mater or to your children or to the ASPCA? So having kind of a well thought out intention and agenda and having that with the lawyer. So, the sandwich generation, the moniker came, I think, out of a New York Times article more than a decade ago. And it's a nice visual because it does sort of provide an understanding of what it is, which is being stuck in the middle. And what that means is you're human trying to maybe raise good humans. You have kids at home, you're advocating for the older generation, whether it's parents or older loved ones, while simultaneously trying to make your way through life. GCMs are an incredible resource because they can help you find housing, help you find care, help you find the right care, help you find a neurologist, find the right doctor who specializes in Parkinson's, help you talk to your sister who's giving you the hardest time ever, negotiate the family dynamics. They can do so much. And having a geriatric care manager in place can set the stage for success when it comes to sandwich generation care planning.
When it comes to planning for end of life, we often avoid the conversations until it's too late. Wills, trusts, healthcare directives can feel intimidating and cold. But behind every legal document is something profoundly human, a family trying to protect what matters the most. My guest today, Candace Dellacona, has dedicated her career to helping families do just that. As a principal and shareholder in her firm's estate and a trust practice, she has guided generations through life's biggest transitions with compassion and clarity. Candace calls herself a family lawyer for a good reason. Her work spans from everything from helping young adults prepare their first directives to advocating for the elderly and guiding members of the sandwich generation who are caught between caring for children and aging parents. Today, we're talking about how to bridge the gap between practitioners and clients and getting a better understanding of what the sandwich generation is. Because when the what if happens, you will have wished you had. I would like to welcome my guest, Candace. How are you doing? Thank you for your patience. I appreciate you so much.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
No, absolutely. So as I start, I always just like to just dive right in and get into the meat of things. So the conversation that we've had offline, we've talked about 2 main things, which is bridging the gap between practitioners and clients, and then also the sandwich generation. I want to start off with the sandwich generation. And before I start to ask my questions, could you just give us a clear understanding and definition of what the sandwich generation is? Because even when we started talking, I was not clear. I learned this from you. So could you just give our listeners just a clear understanding of what that is?
Absolutely. So, the sandwich generation, the moniker came, I think, out of a New York Times article more than a decade ago. And it's a nice visual because it does sort of provide an understanding of what it is, which is being stuck in the middle. And what that means is you're a human trying to maybe raise good humans. You have kids at home, you're advocating for the older generation, whether it's parents or older loved ones, while simultaneously trying to make your way through life. So the sandwich generation is really all of us, because even if you don't have children, you may have someone that you care for, that you provide sort of a parental guidance role in their life. If you don't have parents, you may have a really dear friend or aunt or uncle who you advocate for. So I think that there was a need to sort of frame the issue of what so many of us were feeling.
So, does the sandwich generation only apply to family members, or can it apply to like a spouse, or can it apply to like friends as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I will say it really applies to most of us, right?
Hmm.
Because even if it's not all of the time in our lives, at one time, I guarantee every one of the listeners out there has sort of felt stuck in the in between where you're stretched too thin and trying to advocate for people you love and trying to be the best parent, the best friend, the best daughter, the best son, niece, nephew, grandson. So it really sort of conjures the feeling of the human experience and trying to be there for the people you care about.
So I agree with you 1,000%. And when you had mentioned that the first time in our conversation, I didn't know that I've been a part of the sound generation my entire 20s, from losing my father, my grandmother, my wife, like, and then having to care for my daughter or my son and deal with the lack of conversations that were had with my family when it comes to, like, we feel like the feeling of feeling just lost and not knowing what to do. And I think that a lot of people out there that are in this sound generation that have older parents that maybe have a way of conditioning from just what was passed down from their parents, if you had to maybe give some tools for us that are stuck or are in the sounds generation, of how do we start to communicate or start to open up and talk to that elder, loved one, parent, family member about these preparations and things we need to put in order, as we are the ones that are caretaking for them when they're so resistant.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a couple of things that I think are really important when you find yourself sort of stuck in the middle. And, you obviously are a prime example of somebody that was advocating for your wife, the love of your life, while raising a newborn. So you lived it. And, I think that often we act out of necessity, but there are tools that can make it easier. I would say when you start the dialogue or you recognize there's a need to start the dialogue, the best advice that I can give that I think is the most effective is starting a conversation with care and with love. And what I mean by that is the reason why you're having the conversation with the person is because you love them. And so I think that that piece has to be at the forefront of the conversation, not talking about deficits or what maybe is going on with them, whether it's memory impairment or a diagnosis of something like what you dealt with in terms of cancer or some kind of condition, but really saying, I want to talk to you because I love you and I want to figure out the best way to help you. And I
Sure.
think starting from that place can't really lead you wrong.
I agree. And I think that, speaking from experience and even hindsight, like, you don't have to make the conversation complicated, difficult. The framework around the conversation for the individual that is looking to have that type of conversation with that loved one is, just look at it as, what are the things that I would like to remember about this person and the time we spent with this person, and start to build that foundation and that bond. Because I believe that when you skip over that and you go right into the nitty gritty, the defense mechanism comes up and then they become resistant in wanting to talk about, because they are starting to, their mindset of what they are thinking about during that time is not the same as what you're thinking about.
I think
So,
that's, yeah, sorry. I think
no,
that's
go ahead.
absolutely true. I think, one of the things that is the common thread for all of us is that the conversation has to start because something has happened.
Sure.
And that something is usually not something great. It's
Yeah.
someone aging and their age is reflecting in their memory or capacity. It's someone receiving a diagnosis. It's somebody having an injury. It's somebody who really is not able to care for themselves. And so someone else is observing their need to step in. So you're already in a position where stress is there and people are already on the high alert. But that's why approaching the conversation that's already rife with landmines and the way you approach it is so important because that can set the stage.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you 1,000%. And, you know, we had this, we touched on this briefly too. I just believe, especially in my culture, we are already navigating landmines already. And now we're trying to bring in another bomb that has been this taboo topic and question in our families and in our culture for years, which, it was something that was at the forefront of our minds for our ancestors because it's something that they dealt with every single day. So those conversations and preparations were made every single day, opposed to now we just plan for everything else but that. In your experience in helping families, can you give maybe a story or a situation of a family that didn't have the conversation versus a family that did have the conversations, and kind of what were the results of them not just having the conversations versus the ones who did?
So before I give you an example, I think you brought up something really meaningful just now, which is the cultural aspect. And you're talking about culture in a broader sense, as a Black man here in America, and talking about what your experience in America as a Black man with a Black family. And I think that, you know, I will tell you that every single family deals with those cultural identities and it seeps into these conversations. And
Sure.
so, for anyone listening out there, I think you have to think about that too, where sometimes these conversations are harder for certain cultures because of the way in which, for generations, these topics were talked about or were not talked about. And so having sensitivity to that, including the practitioner who's guiding you, having sensitivity to that is absolutely vital. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah. And so I had someone else on my podcast, Karina, and we talked about dealing with these conversations in Hispanic culture and the things that they are challenged with and the obstacles that they're challenged with, which gave me a whole new insight on some of the struggles that they have. And, they just talked about their family, and when it comes to people passing and them being here in the States versus in their countries and not being able to either send their family member back home or have their family member come here because of paperwork. And she's first generation of immigrants from her family. So when it comes to dealing with those type of conversations, there's a lot of other like legal documentation and paperwork that goes into those preparations that I think the family is not ready to address or talk about because of all that goes into that. So I think that, yeah, I think culturally it is, there's different obstacles in every culture. And that has been, I think, one of the main oppositions from culturally us having those type of conversations when it comes to end of life preparations.
I think you're right. I think, too, even beyond being afraid to have the conversations, I think the family dynamic plays significantly into that. When you have a patriarchal sort of traditional family that I came from, my father was, a proud Irishman and was very progressive, but he was the dad. And so having conversations with him directly about money, about documents that were in place, about did you do the planning, dad, when he was the patriarch of the family. It really, we both sought a lot of grace in having these conversations. And I think that that's important. So beyond, being excluded from certain conversations when you're in a country that throws up roadblocks in a number of ways, not even having the opportunity to have the conversations, to a family structure that doesn't lend itself to having those conversations, it's really hard. But, back to your original question, Jason, about an example of when it worked out, I'll give you my own example. As I mentioned, my dad was sort of this patriarchal guy, very progressive, though I will say. One of the things I loved most about him, he was not into gender roles at all. But we had some really meaningful conversations. He was diagnosed with cancer and had survived. So it brought to the forefront, the what if. What would you want, Dad? And I was in a position where my father was remarried. So his wife was not my mother. And it can be really complicated when you have a family dynamic which isn't the traditional, quote unquote, whatever that is, nuclear family. And so I had a really good conversation with my dad about the type of life he'd want to live and the type of care that he wanted. And he was definitely somebody who was very low maintenance. And you'd ask him how he was, even after major surgeries, he would say, everything's great, would never complain. But I also knew that he said he didn't want to live a life in pain. And so when something else happened with his health, I was able to advocate for him because I felt his words move through me. And I really was able to articulate what his wishes would have been to his wife, who I think was not necessarily ready to let him go. But I felt so confident in what was the right thing for my dad, not because it was my thought, it was because his words were with me. And so having that conversation can make a situation that's unbelievably difficult go really well. And I was able to usher my dad out of this world in the way that he was able to usher me in, which is a rarity. And I know that. And I'm grateful for that every day.
How old were you when you had this conversation with him about this?
So the conversation actually happened when he was diagnosed with cancer. So it was probably 8 years ago. I was in my early 50s and he died 2 years ago. So it happened, maybe 6 years before I actually had to make the decision.
And so before that, did you guys ever have those conversations, or do you lend your experience and practice and conversations that you've had with other people that gave you that knowledge and confidence to need to have that conversation with him?
It's so funny. I live it, right? And this is my practice. And it's so interesting to be on the other side. I've been practicing law for 23 years, since in my late 20s. And, not that I was flippant about the conversations, but I was sort of like baffled when my clients and the family members would say, I don't know how to say that. And I'm thinking, just say it.
Yeah.
When you live it, and you're on the other side. And, I think what also plays into it, Jason, we've talked about this. You and I have spoken about this offline. When you are someone's loved one and you're their advocate and they are sick and you're trying to be positive and saying, we're going to get through this together and the treatment's going to work. Or, no, I think you're doing great. It's really hard to then segue to say, let's talk about when you're not doing great.
Mm-hmm.
My goodness, right? Talk about a mood killer.
Yeah.
Talk about something that is just like the opposite of optimistic, right? So I think I had that difficulty by trying to transition the conversation into being like, we're going to be okay and I'm going to be here and the doctors are amazing, to let's talk about when things go wrong. And I know you had that same sort of feeling where it's like this tension between wanting to be optimistic and wanting to advocate and want the very best, but then trying to also be a realist.
Absolutely. And I think that so my wife was when I tell you, she walked in the spirit, and she was like, that was just the way that her DNA and design was. She didn't believe anything outside of what she read in God's word. But me, she's battling with her life. That's all she's worried about. I'm having to deal with family, doctors, children, her parents. And, her mom she asked the question. She's like, well, you guys never talked about this? And I said, well, no. And this was when it came to the do not resuscitate order. And I was like, no, because she never believed that would actually come into place and she would need that. So based upon that, I had to make other type of arrangements around that, because she's still here. She's still coherent. Like, I can't, if that's not something that she believes in or she believes, but when that decision does come, I know enough about her where she was the life that she wanted to live and how she wanted, especially when it came to her son and the way that I was very clear on that. And I think that this story, even about yourself, actually, I want to transition into something when it comes to bridging the gap between practitioners and clients, because something popped in my head as you were telling me your story. I didn't know you were going to tell me your story. How has your story, because so the issue that we are running into or we're finding with practitioners, and we talked about this as well, is when I was like, well, you know, when it comes to clients, like us making it, hard to receive the information. And then you were like, but also practitioners make it hard as well. But your story, you are probably few that have lived on both sides. So your approach is different. And I think that that may be why some people are looking at it from a transactional standpoint, where you look at it more of a relational standpoint. And then that transaction follows after the relationship. But you have lived that. So when it comes to, I guess, practitioners, what do you find has been some of the biggest pitfalls when they're trying to build that type of relationship?
So, you really hit on something that's very nuanced. And I think you're right that one of the things that I enjoy most about this type of job is that I do see it as something much, much deeper than transactional. And I think in general, lawyers are not drawn to this field for things like that.
Mhm.
And so when I sit down with a client, it is never lost on me that in most circumstances, this is the first time they've gone through something like this. And if it's not the first time, they've experienced somebody else going through something like this. And so they're taking time to talk about things like their legacy, which, I know you as a legacy strategist know a little something about, but their life's work and who they love and who they trust. And I don't think that there's anything more tender in the human experience than those things. So it's really important that as practitioners, we treat it with the requisite honor that those topics and those feelings and relationships deserve. It's so important for practitioners to not be lost on the you do this day in and day out.
Yep. And yes, that is, I had a conversation with a group of insurance agents. They brought me in and want me to speak to their market about Legacy Card Deck. And I was just explaining to them about the tool and how it's used to, how it allowed me to build my relationship with my insurance agent, who I have now referred him. It wasn't transactional. It was something that was relational. And because it was relational, I've sent him, he's written millions of dollars worth of policies because and I had this conversation with them. My mom is an insurance agent who writes life insurance policies. There was still a lack of relational aspect when it came with her in regards to the insurance and what my needs were, what I was looking to do. It was still very much transactional, but that's all she knew. And when she connected me to her colleague, Randy, like we built a relationship where from my wife and then him insuring my son and my business partners. And when he talks to me about, how am I doing? And we were going through like, and he was, from him writing the policy to not even, this was something him not even thinking about, like not even, we didn't even think about this. And for us to have these like he has literally been there. And even when I come to him, it's always been relational. And I just think that that is a huge part that practitioners miss that. And maybe it's just because of my business acumen and background of understanding that business is relationships and relationships turn into transactions, where most people who are transactional try to form a relationship versus with the transaction, and it never ends up manifesting into anything. And I think that, I would like to maybe ask you, when it comes to practitioners that are going to be watching this, what are maybe three things you could give them as tools for changing their approach to dealing with a client or engaging in forming a new relationship with them?
I think it's really important that you're authentic. because the authenticity piece doesn't have to be turned on, right? It's not a switch. You're not selling. When I do an estate plan for people, it's because they need it. I don't have to convince them. I do have to explain how it works and what will happen if they don't have a plan in place. And that's where your expertise comes in. But the part I think that's most important is the compassion piece and trying to figure out who's sitting across from you, because it is never one size fits all. You can have two parents and three kids with exactly the same number of assets held exactly the same number of ways, but it is entirely different from family to family. And the only way you're going to figure that out is by listening to them. So in addition to being authentic, is you have to listen, because they will tell you things in ways that are not responsive to the questions that you ask. They're going to give you an insight to their family dynamics and how they feel about money and control and each other and their son-in-law. And they're going to talk about what happened in their own family with an estate contest. They're going to talk about money insecurity and the feeling of making sure that there is, quote, enough and that their care will be there. They're going to talk about a parent who had Parkinson's. They're going to talk about their brother who was on a ventilator. And all of those things are cues. And if you are listening in the way that you should be, then the client is going to feel heard and you will have them forever, because they'll know that you care for them and you're present with them.
Yep. No, and so, which his episode will be coming out later. And I love you, Jonathan. You know I love you, because, and I would never cheat on you. But if I had to, I would be coming over here to Candace. But so, because you remind me so much, but same thing. Like, so my lawyer has been with me and my wife from the very beginning, and he handles all of my, so he did my estate planning, but I started talking to him about estate planning once again years ago. But the conversations that once again we had were very relational conversations. And with him, I've been with him now for 5 years, and he's done my businesses, my estates, and anytime there's anything regarding my life and infrastructure, he's the person that I go to because of the relationship that I built with him. And it was never a transactional thing. It started off as a relationship. So when practitioners are approaching a situation with a transaction in mind, how would you recommend? Because most of the time they're looking at, well, financially, where is this person at and what does this person have? And then that's going to gauge the level of effort, time, and energy I put into this. If I'm not able to see that immediate return right now, have you experienced dealing with that? And what would be your approach if the person that is contacting you or reaching out to you doesn't necessarily have the initial, I guess, which I don't believe that paying for an estate plan and having millions of dollars in assets to put in an estate plan are completely two different things. I believe in building the actual moat and then adding those things into the moat and having the preparation versus waiting to get those things and then having to build it around it. So I guess that's a two-part question: is your recommendation when practitioners are dealing with people who are still working towards building that versus not having it, like how would be that approach? What would you recommend for the practitioners dealing with that aspect of it?
So, it's kind of twofold, right? I think everyone deserves an estate plan. And I think you're right that you should probably think in advance. So what I would tell the clients out there and the practitioners as they relate to those clients is that not everybody needs the Cadillac of estate plan, right? You can build on an estate plan. If it's a good foundational plan, you pivot. That's what it's supposed to do. Life changes, your estate plan must change. And so what I would say to a practitioner is, look, not every practitioner is set up to take on every client, but I call it what you want. I'm going to call it karma, but I'm in it for the long game, relationships. And so I can't tell you how many times I've helped a new couple, they have a baby and their mortgage exceeds even the value of their house. All they needed was guardianship for their child, right? To say that if God forbid something happened to the two of them, what would happen to their kid? Because they're basically in the red. It doesn't take a lot of time to do the right thing and help people. They will remember you, because if they are on the other side one day and they have accumulated assets and they remember the time and the compassion and the care that you took to talk to them when they had nothing, they will think of you when they have more. That being said, there are situations where I'm not the right lawyer. And I think it's really important to tell the client that. And I have done that. And I've also won goodwill for saying that and introducing that prospective client to another lawyer who could do a better job, who is more in their wheelhouse. So, I guess in a way, the advice is contradicting, right? Where it's showing kindness and take on who you can. But I also think you should listen to the client. And if you know that there's another lawyer who could serve them better, I think it's the right thing from a moral perspective to pass them on and usher them through, because they will also remember that.
So maybe it's contradicting. I don't think so. But the one thing I will say is it is remains consistent and congruent with your core principle, relationships. Whether I can help you or I can't help you, I'm not going to soil a relationship because I can't help you right now. Or I'm going to build a relationship with you by still sending you to somebody else because I'm building a relationship with you and the person that I'm sending you to. And if I can do this thing that is going to help this person down the line, it's still a relationship. And I believe the reason why you have been in the practice that you have been in for 23 years is if you probably look back, you probably didn't have the clear understanding of how you were so relational then that has just compounded into an awareness now where the relationship aspect of being a practitioner is the thing that actually, I believe, separates someone from having something sustainable and building something sustainable as a actual career versus being transactional. And because I'm the first person who goes with, Jonathan was not my first lawyer. Randy was not the first insurance agent. The relationship that I've built with them, I've been with them for 5+ years. But like you said, my kids will go to them, like my family, my friends, but those were times where, and there's been times where Jonathan, he has done the same thing. I can't help you with this, but let me connect you with somebody that can. And even if he wasn't able to. So I think that is something, my biggest takeaway thus far with what you have been communicating and what has led to the success of building a client list and helping clients has been relationships. When it comes to clients, have clients ever communicated to you what their fear is of dealing with their practitioner in this field?
All the time. In fact, that's how I get some of my clients, right? Where they've had such a negative experience with a practitioner that they end up with me because they've heard that a friend or a family or loved one has had the opposite experience. But I've had to help clients segue out of relationships with accountants and tax advisors and other lawyers and insurance brokers and real estate folks. So yeah, I think things that come easier maybe to you and me are not as easy for other people, but that doesn't mean it's not a skill that can be honed. And I think that's really important. We all have the ability to listen. And I think if we take a breath and listen, particularly lawyers, they're not great at listening in general. We're sort of taught to constantly frame and state our position and help people work their way through. But I think the best way to be a good lawyer is to be a good listener. That's where you should start.
No, I agree. And it's funny, man, Jonathan, I'm telling you, she's gunning for you. But Jonathan, same thing. I had a conversation. He connected me with a CPA and I would call him like, John, hey, I don't know about this. And he was like, hey, man, listen, based upon what you're telling me, and this is somebody that he referred to me. He was like, you may need to look for somebody else that can handle this better. And she just may not be equipped in this area. based upon that. And, based upon just the conversation, I know he should be billing me for my conversations that I be having with him. He, but based upon that, I listened, went, got another tax person that cleared up what I've been trying to do for 2 years with this person, cleared it up in 3 weeks. And
I'll tell you a really quick story. So my son had an accident when he was young and he broke his leg. And he was really young. He was in a body cast and it was a disaster. And I remember saying to somebody that the doctor was awful in that he wouldn't speak to my son and he had a terrible bedside manner. But, he was the chief of the department. And I kept saying, but he's the chief of the department. So I guess this is what, we're left with. And I remember a friend said to me, but if you can't talk to the doctor and he's not looking at your son with compassion, you got to move on, because bedside manner is just as important as the care that you're getting. And I think that that's true with lawyers too,
yeah,
particularly with estate planning, because I could be the best lawyer and draft the best trust and I can memorize the tax code. But if I can't feel in a way that I can connect with you and my clients don't feel heard and they don't understand the information, what good is it? So I do think it's a lost art. I think it's really important. I'll say to your listeners out there that for any clients, any people that feel that they're not connecting with their accountant or their lawyer or someone that's giving them advice, find somebody else. And the
sure.
best way to look is really to talk to your friends and your loved ones to say, who do you know? Who's had a good experience? And talk to that lawyer. They should be willing to hop on a call with you and see if there's a rapport there before you move forward, because you are
Yep.
talking about really important and tender things.
I agree. And I had a conversation with, I think it was Lynn. Okay. Thank you. So she's actually the last guest that I had. I'm actually going to speak at her insurance agent company in LA this weekend. And she said something which aligns with what you said. Is she calls it the Magnificent Seven, but I actually like to take the name, I'm kind of recoining it from the stock market, called the Mag Seven, which is everybody needs a Mag Seven: lawyer, insurance agent, therapist, lawyer, insurance agent, therapist, accountant. It
Real estate
was
agent.
real estate agent. I think it was business coach. And there was like one more. I need to go back through it, because when she said it, I was like, I may be missing one of those. But all of the, like, I got 6 out of those 7. But those, building that list out of those 6 came from having conversations and being referred over from people and taking the time. Because you said something that, everybody may not be, I can't remember exactly. I didn't write it down, in regards to just maybe the knowledge or information or the understanding. But in this day that we're in today, in 2025, there is the accessibility to information, and just to get a comprehensive understanding, which obviously is why we are both doing this type of work and having this type of platform, to be able to, hopefully people can take this information and start to just get a comprehensive understanding. You don't have to be a mastery in estate planning. You don't have to be a mastery in accounting. You don't have to be a mastery in life insurance, but having a comprehensive understanding, so you can at least understand what questions to ask and what questions not to ask, is important. Which, that's a question I would like to ask you when it comes to clients. What would you recommend clients that are looking to get estate plans? What are 2 questions that you would ask them to ask whatever practitioner they're looking to work with? And then the sandwich generation, if they are caretaking for somebody, what would be 2 questions that they should ask the person, the practitioner, in regards to making sure their loved one they're taking care of is protected?
So I think in preparation for any meeting that you have with an estate planning lawyer, I think it's really important for you to go into that meeting ahead of time, thinking about what your goals are and who you trust, right? Because one of the things that go in the documents are who your people are, whether for healthcare, finances, that kind of thing. Think of who your people are. And who those people would be that you would trust in the event that you can't make decisions for yourself. And then what your goal is. Is your goal to make sure that you can leave as much money as possible to your alma mater or to your children or to the ASPCA? So having kind of a well thought out intention and agenda and having that with the lawyer. I think it's also important to talk about, brass tacks. How do you charge? What does this usually cost? Because I think it's important for most people who are budgeting and thinking about things like this. Are you going to bill me hourly? Is it a flat fee? If it's hourly, what's the average cost for something like this? You should ask it. You're not buying a car without asking how much it costs. You already know in advance.
Sure.
So don't be embarrassed about that. I think it's important to know those things. And then with respect to the sandwich generation, as you advocate for the older generation, for example, I think it's really important if you're worried about care, and I'm talking about physical care, there's a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, I think it's really important to talk to an elder law attorney that's licensed in that state, because there are all different scenarios based on where you live. So
Sure.
in New York, for example, we have a great Medicaid program for middle class people. Texas, you do not, right? So knowing what the universe is in terms of resources when you step into the shoes of being an advocate for somebody older than you. If they live in the state of New York, all right. If you're in New Jersey or in Texas, the government's not going to help you. So let's figure out who can and let's get those resources together. And the best place to start, that quarterback, is generally the elder law attorney. The other bit of advice I would give you as a sandwich generation member is if you're advocating for somebody older and they are sick, whether they've received a diagnosis, they're in the midst of treatment, is talking to a care manager. And there are all different types of care managers. We usually call them geriatric care managers, but they help more than people who are elderly. And they're generally less expensive than lawyers. They are social workers, they are nurses, they're nurse practitioners sometimes, and they can help be the quarterback for you from a care perspective and get you the resources in place pretty quickly.
Where can they find, say it again?
Yeah, a geriatric care manager.
And where would they find them at?
Yeah. So I think the best place to start to find a geriatric care manager is to Google one and you read the reviews. They're often reviewed online. There are accreditation entities, but to be honest, a lot of people can be a care manager because you could have all sorts of backgrounds. You could have a social work background, a nursing background. There are some doctors that serve as care managers. But I think that, particularly as our population ages, GCMs is what we call them. GCMs are an incredible resource because they can help you find housing, help you find care, help you find the right care, help you find a new neurologist, find the right doctor who specializes in Parkinson's, help you talk to your sister who's giving you the hardest time ever, negotiate the family dynamics. They can do so much. And having a geriatric care manager in place can set the stage for success when it comes to sandwich generation care planning.
So I think that that's a great place to start to land this plane. And that's why it blows my mind, because every time, and I just, hey guys, I just put my own foot in my own mouth right now, because every time I think that there's like the comprehensive knowledge that I have about just end of life preparations, like when I have, and this is why I love talking to knowledgeable, experienced practitioners, because I learn something new from every conversation. And this is something that, once again, like I know that I had no clue about and didn't even know that something like that even existed. And I think that that is a great tool to have when you are navigating this in the sandwich generation. So, okay. Before we get ready to land this plane, the last question is, obviously, I know that having these conversations are tough.
Yeah.
And most of the time, I strongly believe that these conversations need to be had before the actual practitioner comes up. It should not be the first time they're having these tough conversations is when the practitioner shows up to their house or shows up to their office, where they're like, you're talking about all of the things that you had mentioned just beforehand. So I, as you guys know, have the legacy card deck that I created, and I was able to share it with Candace and as a practitioner. So as a practitioner and also just as someone who's gone through it, could you share with them your experience that you had with the card deck?
First of all, I just, I'm so moved by your story and your mission, because it really is a mission. This to you is not a business, and you lived through something that most people would never be able to survive with the grace and the dignity that you have. And so I just have to give you so much credit for finding your way through, and in finding your way through trying to help other people. So I really admire the platform that you've created. And I'm so happy that I am a part of that platform, and you're helping my clients find the tools. Because as I started this conversation with you, I said, have the conversation and start it with love. Sometimes it's not that easy. And so what you have done with the cards is really found a way to bridge the gap, which was your term. And what I mean by that is family relationships are complicated. And so sometimes you can't just sit down and say, let's talk. Having this buffer with this deck of cards is really remarkable, because it's not these doom and gloom questions. And I'm going to share with the listeners what I did about 2 weeks ago. My husband and I decided to grab drinks and dinner. It happened to be my birthday, and I was going to be away that weekend. So we never do this, but we celebrated midweek. It was a Wednesday. And he and I met both coming from work, and I had received a deck of your cards a couple of days prior, and I threw them in my bag. And so we get to the pub in Midtown, and I take out the deck of cards, and I say to my husband, okay, let's look at these. And he's like, what are these? I'm like, hold on, we're going to start. And I'm going to share with you that we had some of the most meaningful conversations in that night, in that bar, and then in the restaurant after, because I kept it up, than we've had in a really long time. And I've been married for a long time, 23 years. And I have a strong marriage, a strong friendship. And I learned things about my husband and about our family and how he saw things that I don't know, Jason, if I would have known before. So, and I said this to you offline. I just think what you've created is such a beautiful way to start these conversations that need to happen. And, the other great thing I'm going to tell people is you're going to feel closer to the person you're having the conversation with. So that's the other fringe benefit.
No, thank you. And I believe everything that you communicated was me taking that pain and turning it into purpose. And when it came to, my initial, focus was, I want to just get these into people's hands, and I want to have people use it as a tool. So, because I know what they're going to navigate, but the mission had now also kind of became this two-part where how can I become an ally with practitioners and make their job easier so they can reach more people, where the people that they're trying to reach, I want them to reach those people. So how can I help them reach those people? But I know one of the biggest obstacles and barriers are having those tough conversations and making those conversations a lot more lighthearted. So that has become my aligned mission with getting these into people's hands and then helping practitioners make their job easier so they can give the necessary important information that I know that is needed to have. But when you have this, you have to actually be able to break through some things first. And that time that it takes to chisel off that hard exterior through the conversations that they are either reluctant to have or haven't had, hopefully this can be that first part that starts to chisel that off, that makes it a lot easier when you guys enter into the room. You ask them a question and they can say, hey, you know what? We actually thought about this, or we actually had a conversation about this. I'm not sure exactly, but it then gives you guys more of a tool and more of information to then use your skill set to then unpack that for them.
That's exactly right. You're cracking it open and you're helping us do the work. And, your mission is really a remarkable one. And I'm so happy to champion it. The world is definitely a better place having people like you think about things like this.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So where can people find you, and also where can they listen to your podcast, which is amazing? Could you just tell them where they can find you and where they can listen to your podcast at?
Absolutely. So, you can reach out to me. I'm at Offit Kerman, which is a law firm that's nationwide, and feel free to email me. The website is offitkerman.com. And my name is Candace Dellacona at offitkerman.com. That's the email. The podcast, which I would, love for you to listen to and provide your feedback. You're going to have a familiar voice if you listen, because we had a wonderful conversation about legacy, is the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide with your host, Candace Dellacona. That's me. And wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, I think Amazon. So any podcast platform, it is available. So I would
Awesome.
love for you to check it out.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And for the listeners out there, as I always say, remember, end of life planning is not about documents. It's about dignity. It's about giving your loved ones clarity, not confusion. And as we heard from Candace, readiness does not begin with money. It begins with relationships, and it begins with conversations. You can't predict the future, but you can prepare your family for it. Because when the what if happens, you would have wished you would have. I'm your host, Jason Brown. Please like, subscribe, share, and get this into as many people's households so they can just have the platform that equips them with the tools to start having those tough conversations. Because remember, it's about building bridges to being able to break those cycles of having those conversations. So I thank you guys, and we will see you on the next episode of the When Would Have Happened.